Welcome to NoSpinHomilies.com, Bible study of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Friends, today we'll be studying chapters 11, 12, and 13. At the very beginning of chapter 11, Paul talks about how the church in Corinth is wed to Jesus Christ. He writes, "I feel a divine jealousy for you, for I betrothed you to Christ, to present you as a pure bride to her one husband." Here, Paul is acting as the father of the Corinthians, and thus is in charge of safeguarding their purity before marriage. He is preserving them for Christ, who is the husband, who is already betrothed to them by covenant, but who awaits to receive them in his home as a chaste bride in heaven. Now, Paul is picking up on that theme that Jesus constantly preached about in all four of the Gospels, that Jesus was the groom and the church was the bride. And that is the level of intimacy that God wants with us as his church. The level of intimacy between bride and groom now our God seeks with us. And yet in verse 3, Paul warns the Corinthians about these false apostles, in which he writes, "But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." Paul is now giving the Corinthians the allusion to Genesis chapter 3, verse 1 through 7. Paul looks back to the fall of Adam and Eve to warn readers the same danger once present in the Garden of Eden is now lurking in Corinth. And Paul fears that the Corinthians, like Eve and Adam, will be lured away from Christ by the seductive voice of evil. Satan is once again the intruder, this time disguised as these false apostles. Consequently, Paul is establishing a link between these false apostles and their association with Satan. Notice in this beautiful picture the anguish of both Adam and Eve. Adam is holding his face. He can barely come to grips as far as what is happening right now. Eve is so distraught at being thrown out of the Garden of Eden that she can barely even stand. Adam has to literally drag her out of the garden. In verse 5, Paul continues his attack on these false apostles, in which he writes, "I think that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not in knowledge. In every way we have made this plain to you in all things." Paul gives a very sarcastic title to counter these apostles in Corinth. It suggests that these false apostles viewed themselves as superior to Paul. Once again, in verses 7 through 11, Paul defends his practice of refusing financial assistance from the Corinthians. He was able to support himself by manual labor. Remember, Paul worked with leather goods and was a tent maker. Now, the Corinthians unfortunately took this as an insult and an indication that Paul did not love them. To counter this, Paul reveals several reasons for his pastoral decision. First, he wished to lay no unnecessary burden upon the community. Next, he hoped to accentuate the stark difference between his ministry and that of these false apostles, who greedily took great advantage of the Corinthians and their resources. Third, as their spiritual father, he wanted to provide for them in the same way that parents do provide for their children. And finally, in the end, Paul's tireless labor was a greater expression of love than accepting their monetary gifts.